Hello, everyone. Thank you very much for joining. This session today, we're going to be diving a bit deep in the real estate sector. In the session from reports to results, partnering with suppliers for decarbonisation action. My name is Robin Burton. I'm with CBRE, leading some of our programs around supply chain decarbonisation. So really excited to share with you some of the program we've had put in place around that, and to share some of the results we've had, some of the challenges we've had, and also keen to have a bit of a discussion with yourselves around how we can improve. So I'm calling it out now, and I'll call it out again, but really keen to get your questions. We're going to leave some time for that at the end as well. I'll hand over to Julian to introduce himself as well.
Thanks, Robin, and hi, everyone. My name is Julian Vega, and I am the ESG lead within sourcing and procurement for APAC at JLL. And my role is essentially looking at the different ESG programs and initiatives, very focused on our supply chain. And one aspect of that is obviously the decarbonization of supply chain. So really keen to engage in this conversation as well. Thanks, Robin, over to you.
Awesome. Thanks, Julian. I'm going to share my screen now. Okay. Can you see my screen?
Yes.
Yes. Okay. All right. I want to start off by whizzing through a little bit of detail around our climate transition strategy and how sustainable procurement fits within that. So I think it's an important kind of level setting to understand how CBRE is thinking about climate transition and also supply chain decarbonization and how those two pieces go hand in hand. So I won't spend too much time on this section, but just wanted to give you that sort of overarching view. CBRE has a 2040 net zero goal across our entire value chain. So that includes our supply chain as well, which is a hugely ambitious target, and I'll get into a bit more detail on that in a moment. But important to note as well that we've got those interim targets, 50% for scope 1 and 2, and then 55% across the properties that we manage, and the emissions that come from those properties that we manage. So it's a really extensive program and a huge challenge for us. I think this challenge is exacerbated, and I think Julian will probably reflect some of these, because I think the real estate industry has a lot of these challenges shared, where the majority of our emissions are actually coming from the work we do on behalf of our clients. So CBRE itself is a pretty efficient and lean organization. However, we do a huge amount of work purchasing energy, purchasing goods and services in order to support our clients. And so 97% of our overarching emissions are actually coming from that work we do directly with clients. So if we're going to be able to make any progress on supply chain decarbonization, then we're going to have to figure out how to step in line with our clients and work with them to develop shared goals, shared programs around supply chain decarbonization. I don't need to school this audience on what different scopes of emissions are and why supply chain emissions are so important. But I think, I wanted to pull this slide up just to, I guess, level set on, why CBRE is really focused on supply chain emissions and the particular challenges we have as a services industry player as well. Last year, CBRE reported 31 million tons of emissions globally, and we don't manufacture anything. We're not a manufacturing organization. We don't have a strong product kind of supply chain. The vast majority of what we purchase is services that are delivered by people. And so despite that, we still managed to produce 31 million tons of emissions. So it really sort of sets the scene for why we need to focus on supply chain, why we have a particularly unique challenge in the services sector around decarbonization, and working with suppliers that are maybe not as familiar with this concept as well. CBRE late last year launched our supply chain decarbonization transition strategy, a broader transition strategy, which includes supply chain decarbonization within that. The transition strategy is CBRE's, our pathway for achieving decarbonization and achieving that net zero goal. It has 4 key pillars to it. It has maximizing resource efficiency, increasing renewable energy into the operations of both our own business and our clients' businesses. We need to electrify our operations and our clients' operations, and we need to decarbonize the supply chain. So, that final piece, decarbonizing the supply chain, is, 1/4 of our overarching strategy to decarbonize by 2040. And again, 97% of that activity is happening on our client sides and for our clients. Supply chain emissions is particularly critical in our overarching emissions baseline. Supply chain emissions for CBRE generated 5 million tons of our CBRE's overall baseline last year. And we found that we have a hugely decentralized supply chain as well. So we have 7,500 suppliers generating 90% of our supply chain emissions. So we have this kind of, maybe a mismatch compared to what some organizations are more used to in this space, where generally we find that a few hundred suppliers would be generating the vast majority of emissions. For CBRE, with a very decentralized global supply chain operating where our clients are operating all over the world, we have to set up this supply chain that can meet the demands of our clients. And with that, we inherit this hugely complex, dispersed supply chain. And so the challenge for us in this space is, how do we reach those 7,500 suppliers and convince them to work with us on supply chain decarbonization? And how do we get the tools to help us do that? So it's a bit of foreshadowing in terms of what we're going to be talking about in my session. So when we think about the different sources of emissions within CBRE, so we have scope 1, scope 2, scope 3 buckets. All of those, except for scope 3 upstream, which includes supply chain, are on track, and we're seeing some really promising signs to decarbonize. Overall, that means that CBRE has seen some really great progress to date on decarbonization, and we believe that we are in a good place to achieve our net zero goal. However, there is that challenge around supply chain, and it is the only piece where we're sort of seeing some challenges. And so, for us to be able to achieve that goal, we really need to start to turn the tide on supply chain emissions and really start to drive emissions reductions within the supply chain as well. And so I guess part of the thinking behind that is, why are we seeing challenges in supply chain emissions? Why is it not seeing the same improvement despite all the work that we're doing to address it? And so part of that reason is because we have in the past had poor methodologies around measuring supply chain emissions. Those of you on the call are probably familiar with the different ways of calculating supply chain emissions, and the spend-based method is often where companies start. And in that method, you have your amount of spend in a particular category or with a particular supplier, and you multiply that by an emissions factor that is publicly available, and that gives you your estimated total emissions. But what that does is gives you a mathematically linked or coupled emissions calculation. So as your business grows, your estimated emissions grow with it. And so that starts to tell you a bit of the story as to why we saw that increase in emissions over the past few years in the supply chain space. it's because we're using methodologies that are approved, they're perfectly legitimate, but they are kind of a dead-end process. They don't give you real insight into what suppliers are actually doing and how we are working with them on actual decarbonisation initiatives. What we need to move towards is a new world where we have real supplier-provided emissions data. When we get real data from suppliers, we can start to see what initiatives they're putting in place to decarbonize. And so, if they put in place a green car fleet, or if they put in place a green energy purchasing, we can start to see that if we're actually getting from them, real supplier level emissions data, pulling that into our own baseline and representing that back up. So, our ability to get that data is absolutely critical if we're going to uncouple CBRE's business growth from our emissions baseline and start to turn that tide on that emissions overall. However, as you can see in that top band there and on the screen, 90% of suppliers in our supply chain aren't calculating their emissions. And so there's a huge disconnect. If we reach out to suppliers and ask them to provide that data, most of them are completely unable to provide that today, and we'll hear crickets from them. We won't hear a word from them on that. And so we need to unblock those suppliers, and that's something I'm going to talk to in a moment as well. Some of the other challenges in this space that I just want to sort of touch on, because there's a multitude of challenges if you want to start gaining real emissions data from suppliers. I already kind of touched on the fact that there are capabilities that are lacking in the supply chain at the moment. We've found that as well as 90% not being ready, not having the data at all, 2/3 are not willing to demonstrate that and aren't willing to share. And so there's a real challenge there to build the trust with suppliers and get them to share data. We also find that, as I've just demonstrated, emissions accounting methods can hinder progress, and so we need to move towards better accounting methods. We need to establish supplier engagement processes that can be really scalable. As I said, we have to hit 7,500 suppliers, which is a huge lift. And so we need to have systems in place that enable really fast and scalable action with suppliers. And we also need to ensure that the data we're getting is a really high quality. Not only is it financial grade, ready for regulatory disclosure, we also need to be able to use it in procurement processes as well. So we want to be making sure that any data we're collecting is useful for procurement and useful for regulatory disclosure. And so with that comes a really high standard of data quality that we need as well. So I want to touch a bit more about, so what are we actually doing? I think this is the more interesting part of the session. So how are we actually engaging with suppliers today? And why are we engaging with them? And what are we trying to achieve? We're trying to achieve 4 main goals when we're talking to suppliers about giving us proper emissions data. First, we want to identify who are the best suppliers from an emissions point of view. Pretty simple. We want to identify who is the most efficient supplier to deliver any service. Secondly, we want to ensure that we are collaborating with suppliers and developing a system where we can support suppliers to overcome their barriers and build their capability. We want to develop deeper relationships. We want to have a really skilled supplier base. We want to drive more value to our clients. As I said, we do a lot of work for our clients. We do a lot of procurement for our clients. So we want to make sure that we are demonstrating that back to them as well and giving them the pathway to decarbonize as well. And of course, we want to make sure we meet our regulatory disclosures and compliance aspects as well. So again, making sure that quality of data is super high. We've had a 3 times increase in client requests for emissions data over the last year, which is a huge increase. So there's a move. It's not just regulation that is driving us; it's also client demand and market demand that is pushing us in this direction as well. I want to get a little bit nerdy with you for a moment, if I can, and sort of talk through a little bit about how we actually engage with suppliers, because I think this is kind of some of the key takeaways for this session as well. We've developed a 5-step cycle of process where we engage suppliers. The first step for us is to screen suppliers to understand their maturity and really to be able to segregate the suppliers into different buckets. So who are the mature suppliers that are already publicly reporting? For those, we want to make sure we have a really streamlined process. And then who are those suppliers that are maybe just getting started, don't have the data in place? How are we supporting them to unblock and move forward and share the right data? Secondly, we engage them. We have an 8-week data collection campaign structured to get the data from them and really sort of support them to give us the data we need. In that process, we essentially give them 2 streams. So if they're a mature supplier, we pull in their data from publicly available sources. We ask them to confirm that data, and then they go on their way and they can push the send button. Super simple, super easy. For less mature suppliers, we ask them to calculate their carbon emissions using tools provided by our partner Emitwise. What that does is it essentially enables them to get a really quick, free, and easy full 3 scopes of analysis emissions baseline, which they can run through the free calculator provided by Emitwise. That is then reported back to CBRE. And within that 8-week process of our campaign, we have really good usable data for a supplier that before that didn't have anything, was coming from a base of 0. We then evaluate the quality of that data. Again, that comes back to that piece I was talking about around having really good quality data that we can use in procurement, that we can use in regulatory disclosures and our public disclosures. We try to generate for all of these suppliers an emissions intensity factor and a data quality score. And that emissions intensity factor about any specific supplier is what we use to multiply to get our emissions for that particular supplier. And then the cycle comes back. Once we've got that data, we need to be acting on that. And so this is where the rubber hits the road. We need to be identifying where we've got gaps in the data, supporting suppliers to fix any issues we see. Again, we're bringing them up to the standard that we need them to be on. And then as well, we need to be implementing emissions reduction strategies, both for CBRE as a corporate, but also for our clients who use those suppliers every day in their sites. When we develop this program, essentially what we're trying to do is those four items on the top right-hand side there. We're trying to reduce supplier fatigue. We're trying to harness public data where we can get it. We're trying to unblock those suppliers that are getting started. And we're trying to get procurement-ready data, because at the end of the day, this is a sustainable procurement program, and we want to be making sure that we are getting that data into the program as well. I want to touch very briefly as well on, because I'm conscious of time, but I want to touch briefly on engaging small and medium enterprises. Through this process, you can imagine, as we've reached out to thousands of suppliers already, we're reaching out to suppliers of all different maturity levels. And for suppliers that are just getting started, there's a lot, there's sort of extra work or extra hand-holding, extra unique challenges that those suppliers might have. And we've learned a lot in that process on how to overcome those challenges. A lot of these are pretty intuitive, but I just wanted to sort of run you through them. SMEs have a lack of resources. And so to overcome that, we've really tried to invest in capacity building for those suppliers and providing them those tools through that platform. So again, giving them that access to that free calculator is a really and tailored support through that platform is really, really crucial. Suppliers also have really are really cost sensitive. They also often have split incentives. They're trying to figure out what they put their limited resources towards. And so we need to align our incentives and support to that as well. And so we need to make sure that SMEs really see the value in participating. So giving them access to things like our preferred supplier programs, which includes, things like improved payment terms, that kind of thing. We also want to make sure that we also have a challenge with suppliers where they have data and transparency issues. Maybe they don't want to share data. Maybe the data that they do have is of poor quality. So again, we need to work with them to give them the support to be able to overcome that and develop plans to improve over time. So again, working with them, meeting them where they're at, and really trying to solution with them on how they can overcome these barriers. They also have a really they can often also have a fragmented engagement with an organization like CBRE. You know, CBRE, we love it, but it is a beast. You know, it's a huge global organization, and an SME isn't necessarily set up to engage seamlessly with a company this size. And so we need to make sure that we are embedding supplier emissions and the expectations around emissions management into the relationship that already exists with that supplier. So working with the relationship owner in CBRE, working with our strategic and preferred supplier program to ensure that emissions is really integral into those conversations and not just a side program. And that gives you an opportunity to develop a deeper relationship. So far, we've assisted 193 suppliers to calculate their carbon emissions for the very first time using our program and using our tooling. And those suppliers identified over 80 million tons of carbon emissions that were previously unaccounted for in the upstream value chains. So we're super proud of those numbers and really pleased to see that we can unblock small and medium enterprises and we can provide real impact for them as well. Quick shout out as well to say that Emitwise has a partnership with the SME Climate Hub, and all SMEs, they don't need to be CBRE suppliers, but all SMEs can actually access the Emitwise tooling through the SME Climate Hub and get that quick free carbon calculation as well. Also want to shout out that is linked to the relationship with the We Mean Business Coalition and the Supplier Cascade, both of which have awesome initiatives which we're partnering in, and we'll share the resources afterwards, but we have a cool case study in there as well if you want to dive a bit deeper. I'm running out of time, so I'm going to jump through these slides. But essentially, when we get this data from suppliers, and once they go through that whole process, what we can do is actually unpick what are the differences between different suppliers from an emissions point of view. We've got janitorial company A, it's got an emissions factor 3 times higher than janitorial company B. So do we need to just switch a supplier? Or do we need to work with janitorial company A to understand what all these different sources of emissions are? We can see through here that the cleaning equipment and supplies in their scope 3 category is the biggest source of their emissions. So we can potentially actually uncover a pathway for the supplier to decarbonize rather than the rather kind of brutal switching them out and removing them as a supplier. So again, we can uncover the pathway to decarbonization if we have that data. On top of that, we can also uncover the different innovations that might be able to be put in place if we engage those suppliers. So this is a snapshot of one of our categories that we do a huge amount of work in, janitorial, and we've mapped initiatives that could be put in place by suppliers by the how easy it is to implement versus the cost to implement and the potential emissions impact. So something might be in this bottom right-hand quadrant, might be easy to implement, but might have a relatively low emissions impact. If you want to move up the scale, it might be more costly, more difficult to implement, but have a higher emissions impact. So you can start to really unpack and unveil the way forward. We have a whole set of visualization tools that we've embedded as well that help our clients to make better decisions on this as well. I won't spend any time here, but it does exist. Just to finish it off, a few final thoughts from me. And again, I'll share we'll be sharing the resources. So if you want to spend more time with this slide, then happily to do that. But successful supply decarbonization really rests on a few key aspects. We need a really standardized calculation methodology. We need supplier engagement and performance tracking across a huge number of suppliers. You need a really good verification strategy. You can't just rely on standard publicly available data. You need suppliers to meet the threshold so that you can compare apples to apples in the procurement process where you're using that emissions data. You need to measure emissions reductions. So ensuring that you've got a ability to forecast forward and also look backwards and see how much progress you're making year on year. And then finally, we really have to accelerate action. 2040 isn't far away. We need to coordinate across our stakeholder groups. We need to provide solutions for suppliers to unblock, to start addressing their key buckets of emissions and really start to drive this forward. So with that, I want to wrap up and hand the baton back to Julian to share some more about JLL.
Thank you, Robin. And well, the presentation is on screen. Thanks for the presentation. I really like hearing you because it's testament that we're facing similar challenges, similar issues, and addressing those issues in some extent in a similar way, but there are different approaches. There is no silver bullet solution. The point and the challenge is how can we support our supply partners in decarbonizing the supply chain. So thanks for your presentation. From my end, if you go to the next slide, I really like to begin by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land where I'm today. For me, is the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, and I like to pay my respects to the elders past, present, and emerging, and I'll also like to extend that respect to any other Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islander present in this call today. Now, moving to the next slide, very briefly, for those who might not be familiar with JLL and what we do, I think it's important to set this in. But essentially, we're also a leading global commercial real estate and investment management company, and we cover different aspects of real estate lifecycle, from supporting clients to find space across different industries, whether it's finding new office, upgrading, relocating, but also managing properties and portfolios. And this is I guess, the important part of where I fit into JLL on property management and the engagement that we have here with different suppliers. But essentially, it's the entire supply chain, the entire life cycle, covering different services from investing and delivering different projects and transforming with technology. Now, to put this on a scale, please, if you can jump to the next slide. Brief summary, and these numbers, I think, they are important to set the scene about the challenges that we're facing into this industry. The scale of operations and global presence poses different challenges. I think two specific call outs in these numbers that you see on screen. First one is we work with over 70 or more than 70,000 suppliers globally. So that's a big, complex supply chain, and with presence globally. And this extensive supplier network, it's really important to our operations, but also represents a significant opportunity to drive positive environmental and also social impact. The other aspect or other, I guess, key takeaway in these numbers is that we manage sourcing activities on behalf of our clients. So we are responsible not only for corporate procurement, but also, as Robin mentioned, we are in charge of sourcing activities from our clients. And this represents in total of over 14 billion spent in the year. So it's a huge spend, tens of thousands of suppliers that we engage with, and where we need to work on ways to decarbonize. So this gives us really big, a tremendous leverage to influence sustainability practices through the supply chain. My remit is within Asia Pacific, so some of the examples and challenges and practical solutions, either regardless that many of these are global, my main focus is to cover some of the challenges that we're seeing or facing in Asia Pacific, but also the opportunity that we have to make a significant impact through procurement practices and supplier relationships. Now, moving to the next slide, we do have a framework for responsible sourcing, which essentially is a practice to integrate environmental, social, and economic and governance considerations into our procurement processes. I'm focusing today, for the sake of this conversation, on environmental aspects that are particularly relevant to our decarbonization efforts. But this environmental procurement component within the framework, it helps to reduce the negative impacts related to greenhouse gas emissions, biodiversity loss, chemical use, waste generation, also focuses on increasing climate resilience. So this means that we are sourcing products, but in the majority services. And when we do that, we're not only looking at cost and quality, we also considering different factors such as the carbon footprint of the products and services that are being delivered, depending on the nature of the services, if there are use of harmful chemicals, the potential of waste reduction or recycling, also considers the ability of suppliers to adapt and mitigate climate risk. So when we implement this framework, or by using this framework, we are able to make more informed decisions that align with our sustainability and environmental goals. And this goes beyond compliance. This is about driving real positive change in our supply chain and by extension, the broader real estate industry. Now, if we go to the next slide, there is a statement that I'd really like to break a little bit into parts. So we say together with our suppliers, we aim to drive disruptive and impactful change by embedding ESG into everything we do. So what does it mean? I think there are three elements or aspects on this. The first one is that we recognize that to achieve significant change, we need to collaborate with our suppliers. The second is that when we say that JLL aims to drive disruptive and impactful change, this suggests that JLL is looking for innovative, potentially industry-changing approaches rather than only incremental improvement. And the last piece of this is that the key to this disruptive and impactful change is embedding ESG into everything we do. And by these considerations, or embedding these considerations into all aspects of the business operations and decision-making processes, we aim to ensure that sustainability is not just an add-on, but also a fundamental part of how we operate. Now, moving to the next slide, we do also have net zero targets. We in 2021 we became the first real estate company to be recognized for aligning net zero commitment with climate science. We have a near-term target that is about reducing absolute scope 1, 2, and 3 emissions by 51% by 2030, and also a long-term target aligned with the SBTi initiative, which is reducing absolute scope 1, 2, and 3 emissions by 95% by 2040 from a 28 baseline. This is the kind of things that resonates Robin's presentation about the challenges, but also the scope 3 emissions and the emissions that are within the supply chain from the services that we deliver to the clients. That's the biggest hurdle. And we can only achieve that target if we partner with our suppliers. That's a huge opportunity. Our clients, they also have set net zero targets. So this creates a common goal for us to achieve together. And as you probably are familiar, scope 3 emissions are the hardest to measure and challenging to reduce. Different scope of categories, but it's the challenges which I'm going to talk about on how to collect the data and how to analyze and how to support suppliers to drive emissions reduction. And in effect decarbonizing. Now moving to the next section, I want to highlight that there are many challenges that we're seeing, not only globally, but as I said, focusing from an APAC perspective. And I want to talk about three particular ones. Some of these have been already pointed out by Robin, which is great. And one of which I want to talk about is a supplier, the maturity that suppliers have around ESG and carbon specifically. Again, to put this in context and around, again, the importance about carbon emissions, it's important to understand that 40% of all carbon emissions globally come from the built environment. So this statistic also underscores the importance of our efforts in this sector. But now talking about some of the challenges we see in APAC, an overall awareness about ESG and carbon issues. So the awareness is definitely growing, but it remains uneven across the different industries and company sizes. So typically large local and multinational corporations, they are making more significant strides in sustainability and carbon reduction initiatives. However, many small and medium enterprises are still lagging behind. That varies between obviously countries in Southeast Asia compared to maybe Singapore or China or even Australia. So that varies, but many of them, and particularly small and medium enterprises, they have challenges due to either economic constraints, knowledge gaps, technology, etc. We are seeing, for instance, talking about Australia, for instance, in growing awareness, as I said, particularly the bigger organizations, driven by regulatory pressure, consumer demands, stakeholder expectations. This is not the case for many other countries. But I think it's important to note that this landscape is evolving rapidly, and because clients are also looking for supplies that are ready for sustainability commitments and decarbonization efforts, we're seeing improvements day by day. The next challenge is around data availability and reliability. Very well said also by Robin during his presentation. This is really critical, especially when it comes to obtaining accurate and comprehensive data across complex supply chains. And there are many issues here. Agree again with when Robin was talking about the different methodologies and starting from a spend-based approach and moving into hybrid methodologies or combining when there is no data or challenges are not reliable. Spend-based approach poses like a reasonable approach to collect the data, but doesn't reflect the truth, and you cannot distinguish between a good performer or a bad performance from a carbon perspective. It's data what is driving the emissions variance. So the challenge is around moving away from spend-based approach. There are challenges on standardized measurement methodologies across different suppliers, data unavailability and unreliability, as I mentioned, the complexity in measuring scope 3 emissions, particularly for service-related activities. Products might look different, but when you look or think about services, there aren't many not references, but methodologies, or there are broader methodologies and approaches and lots of assumptions when it comes to service-related activities, different than products. And in many countries, there is growing legislation and regulation about greenhouse gas reporting, but that's not the case, again, in many other countries. So there's a lack of regulation, but also insufficient regulatory enforcement. Last but not least, there are also technologic and economic hurdles. And this is also, they pose different challenges, and that varies from country to country. But in many cases, it does has high upfront cost for some sustainable technologies and products, or making this change or switch in whether it's the electrifying vehicle fleet in a service-based industry. There is a portion of those emissions that relates to commuting to deliver the services. So electrifying a vehicle, it's an option, but there is challenges on from a technological, but most technological, because technology sees for that is around the upfront cost that suppliers will need to face on reaching this. And again, it comes all to size of the organizations and availability to make this high upfront cost. In some cases, there is limited availability of sustainable alternatives or low carbon products, and particularly services. They are sometimes depending on the service that it's been delivered, but typically there is also a cost uplift in using these products and technologies and services. This poses a challenge in achieving cost competitiveness compared to traditional options. In the end, we manage a lot of services that on behalf of our clients, but there is this competitiveness between sustainability, carbon neutrality, net zero against cost delivery of the services at a reasonable price, or at the most competitive price. So there is a challenge around that. Other challenge, well, there is one around, in many cases, we see resistance of change from traditional practices. That happens quite often as well. So it has a component on educating suppliers and clients sometimes as well in this topic. There is sometimes resistance of change. And again, many countries, they don't have incentives sometimes for emissions reduction. So understanding these challenges, I think it's the first step, or it was the first step for us to addressing those challenges. And in the next slide, I want to talk about exploring some of the initiatives that we're doing in JLL, but some practical solutions that hopefully some of you might adopt as well. So if we move into the next slide, here are a few examples that I'm going to spend a couple of minutes just on this to allow sometimes for questions. But some practical recommendations that we are also doing in as part of our program in JLL. And I think very important to highlight that one first step is establishing a supplier relationship management program that covers ESG or carbon efforts. So that's, I think, really, really important. Everyone might have already an SRM program, but it's really important to incorporate carbon and other ESG elements into that. Mentioned briefly, and I think Robin mentioned as well, supply maturity. This is really important, and what we've been working for almost 2 years already is we develop a framework to identify our suppliers' current state, but also desired state of performance on carbon. And the idea is, I guess, it's not to judge, it's to understand where are they at, where do they want to be, where do we want them to be, and to gradually improve their maturity in. It's a broader ESG program, but has a component around carbon. Every supplier has a different maturity, and the changes don't happen overnight. So you cannot expect a supplier that never measured the carbon footprint to establish a science-based target by the end of the year. That's not gonna happen. So first step is understanding, getting suppliers to knowing whether they have already a carbon greenhouse gas inventory, moving into assurance of those emissions, talking about the challenge that I mentioned before about reliability of those emissions. We cannot just take for granted numbers that are not substantiated, and ideally achieving assurance over those emissions. And then moving forward the ladder to a more leading practices around maturity. The next one is around supplier roadmaps. So once we know the maturity, the desired state of those suppliers, it's important to establish a supply roadmap. And this is developing a roadmap, which is not set by us. We collaborate with our suppliers to define that roadmap together. How does that look like? What are the decarbonization goals? This roadmap should include specific actions, metrics, timelines, and different milestones. Another, I guess, initiative or element we have been working is what we call the ESG standards. So we started developing for the key categories of services that we procure to develop and implement, let's call it, guidelines for managing that product or service delivery according to living practices. And that is to ensure consistent performance, but also drive emissions reduction. Let's take, for example, one of our biggest categories of services is janitorial. So, and a standard or ESG standard for janitorial services looks into how the service is being delivered, the chemicals that are used for cleaning, are there alternatives to chemicals, are green certified chemicals to use, what's the type of equipment, commuting from employees to the different sites. So these specific standards can and should be created for the different categories that we procure, but it also applies for, I guess, in any other industries for products. And what are your minimum expectations and leading practices for standards? Last and not least, we are also engaging with suppliers establishing requirements, so minimum requirements for suppliers. And here we're not asking our suppliers to do anything we're not doing, but we want to set certain expectations in order to collaborate. And these minimum expectations for suppliers, they have progressive criteria that evolve over time, which encourages continuous improvement in environmental performance and decarbonization efforts. Similar with these requirements, similar to what I mentioned to supplier maturity models, this changed over time. So we are not expecting or requesting a supplier that is starting their journey on carbon to already have a net zero goal. But with this, I think the important part of these requirements is the collaboration with them. So we are developing different toolkits and support. So it's not a mandate that we're asking, you need to deliver that, otherwise we're not going to work with you. It's not going in that way. It's more about where are you lacking, where do we want you to be, what are the initiatives or the steps that you can take, as I mentioned with the supplier roadmaps. And the message is that we are supporting our suppliers to reach their targets, but also we want to ensure that they are meeting minimum expectations. And only by that, we will be able to work also in our decarbonization efforts. Conscious of time, have 10 minutes. Next slide. Very quick on the next one, which talks about, just some examples of what does this ESG requirements look like, for instance, from a carbon perspective. But I already talked about this. We expect suppliers to start measuring greenhouse gas emissions in the short term, scope 1 to 3 emissions, using recognized measurement standards like the GHG protocol or ISO 14064. We want them to have a GHG program development. So it's not only about measuring on a yearly basis, it's about establishing and evolve a greenhouse gas emissions program that covers the strategy, the governance, the reporting, moving into what I talk about third-party assurance, progressing from limited to reasonable assurance over time, setting science-based targets, and so on. So I think these are some of the examples of the program, and I hope practical steps that any organization can adopt. And as I mentioned, there is no silver bullet, but wanted to stress on the importance that all suppliers play in our decarbonization efforts, but also their decarbonization efforts, which in the end is also our clients' decarbonization efforts. So it's a win-win situation when we address these aspects. And that's the last slide. And the last one, just a thank you to everyone, and really keen to engage in these conversations. If there are any questions, that will be great to try to address in the best of our abilities.
Awesome. I'm conscious of time. I think we're meant to finish 10 to the hour. Looking to the host to get a nod or not backstage. But as they type to us, I'm just going to answer some of the questions we've got in the chat. So we've got one saying from Andrew for both of us. Did you start getting better emissions data from your suppliers, or did you go right to the emissions reduction, or did you start a different way? Julian, did you want to try that one first?
So the question is about how did we started, like collecting data or asking for reductions? Is that around that?
So it's sort of saying, like, how did you order your program? So did you start with trying to get data from suppliers, or did you start with trying to move on actual actions?
Yeah, no, you know the saying, you cannot manage what you cannot measure. So the first part, similar to, I think you pointed out, we do look after our suppliers' emissions, or whether they're publicly available, which is the best. I mean, if they're already committing or disclosing emissions publicly, that's a really good sign already. So looking into that, but as I mentioned before, engaging with suppliers on requesting that data from them, but also making sense of that. As I said, it's not only a request, we need to analyze the data that we collect. And once we get the data, understand, then we go to the initiatives. We already understand certain industries and categories, where are the hotspots, and then we more or less already know which hotspots do we want to address. But the first step is understanding, collecting and understanding and validating that data.
Yeah, I think it's a similar kind of story with us. You know, I think we started on this journey with some kind of ad hoc kind of engagement with suppliers, that kind of thing. And really you come to a quick realization that unless you can quantify it, unless you can really set a baseline and move forward with a supplier in lockstep, you're really not going to be able to drive the emissions reductions that you want to see. And you're not going to be able to hold them accountable. You know, I think about it as a procurement program, and like in any good procurement program, you need to have data to back up the actions that you want to take next. So yeah, I think you really do need to take that, get your data in order first, although don't let it slow you down too much. But yeah, I think that's sort of generally how I would respond to it. We have another question from Jasleen. She said, was the carbon calculator tool, I think this one's for me, I guess, was the carbon calculator shared with small suppliers or those not yet ready an in-house built tool? Could you provide an example of the tool that is used? So we've developed a partnership with a company called Emitwise. Emitwise is a Scope 3 specialty accounting firm, and they have a calculator tool as part of their tooling that we leverage. And so there's a whole bunch of different tools out there that are used. We did a huge, market exercise to try and find the right partner for us as a business, but there's plenty of different tools out there that can be used. But again, we wanted to make sure that we had something that was going to provide suppliers a really complete experience. So we wanted to get all scopes of emissions, all that kind of good stuff. And then I don't know if you want to jump in on any of the tools that you're using, Julian.
No, that's all right. If we can cover one more question or two this time, happy to.
Cool. So we've got another one from Andrew. It says, for companies that are new to this, can you set an expectation about how long it would take a medium-sized company to engage a significant portion of their suppliers from when they understand they need to look at GHG in the supply chain? So how long is it going to take to set up a program to get moving into space?
It's a really good question, and I guess the answer it depends. Surprisingly, there are some initiatives that are very often low-hanging fruits on when you set a program. There are low-hanging fruits that you can tackle to reduce. If you don't have, I guess, a program or a place to start. Again, I think it varies. It varies the industry. It varies how big is your supply and how complex it is. I think it could range from 3 months to 6 months to establish a program, but it's hard to say a number of how long it takes. It depends on the nature of your business. It depends on how complex and the amount of supplies that you have. But I think it's to establish a overarching or general approach on what are your priorities, what are your actions and your focus. It shouldn't take that long. I think it's more on the implementation and monitoring and the effectiveness of that program what really takes the time. And I would say in many cases you really need to have a dedicated person looking at these initiatives. This is not something that you can do, I think, on the side on spare time. I think this is a dedicated role in if you're looking into decarbonizing or setting a program with your suppliers. What's your experience, Robin, on that?
Yeah, look, I completely agree. I'm always an advocate for getting dedicated resources. Obviously, we are conflicted on that one, but yeah, yeah, I completely agree. I think breaking it down into chunks, like what is your goal for year one? You're not going to necessarily hit all of your suppliers in year one, but what is your 3-year plan, and sort of chunk it down and break it up like that. I'm getting pinged by our wonderful hosts to wrap up. So I just want to say a huge thank you from myself for sharing your time with us today, wherever you are in the world. And we really appreciated sharing what we can, and look forward to hearing about all the other sessions as well. So Julian, if you want to wrap up as well.
No, thanks to everyone for joining. Thanks for sharing this panel, Robin. As mentioned, I think it's really good to have these conversations, and we have the same challenges, and it's important to learn how everyone is tackling and adopt whatever works for everyone. So appreciate, and stay engaged, and hopefully you have a really good sessions moving forward as well.
Awesome. All right. Thanks all. Bye-bye.
As CPO of AstraZeneca, I'm proud that we set one of the most ambitious Scope 3 supplier engagement targets in the pharmaceutical and life science sector. And as a result, at the end of last year, 68% of our spend was channeled through suppliers who are committed to SBTi, which means that 1 in 8 of all the companies on SBTi register are AZ suppliers. Since we joined SPP, we have trained our team in the skills they need to deliver on these targets. And we all face similar challenges within procurement. So working with other companies in the SPP network is helping us build an ecosystem of sustainable procurement knowledge. By doing so, we will maintain our positive decarbonization trajectory and our commitment to build a healthy future for people, for society, and the planet.